I'm going to talk about disasters today and community crises. I'm going to talk about what disasters are, what are community crises, what might disaster journalism be and entail, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about resilience, kind of in depth and focused on community resilience specifically. As Catherine mentioned, we have a center here at the University of Missouri, the Disaster and Community Crisis Center. We're part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, nctsn.org. That's a fantastic informational resource about child trauma of all types, contexts, issues, you name it, it's there. A great resource for students and for anyone working on the area of trauma. So we're a part of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, and we focus specifically on disasters and community crises. We're developing resources for youth, children, families, communities around these issues, around trauma, mental health, and these sorts of events. Several people in the audience from our crew, Mimi, Elise, Sarah, so thanks for being here. Stop by our website and check out some of the materials that we have, and hopefully you'll find them useful. And Elise told me to mention to be sure to follow our Twitter account, that she is getting off the ground and we desperately need followers. DCC_center? Yes. So let's start with what is a disaster. So Catherine asked me to talk about the community effects of trauma. And so I think the sort of most likely experience that a community can have that will have sort of broad traumatic effects is likely to be a disaster or community crisis. These sorts of large-scale events are often the type of events that will have an impact on a community and will really see community effects. And so that's why I'm going to talk about disasters and community crises specifically. Now, there are examples of, for example, a student committing a suicide having an effect on a school community. So there are more kind of discrete personal events that can certainly impact communities, and we can talk about those and think about them. But really, when we think about traumatic effects on a community, broad mental health effects, we think of these larger events. And so that's really what I'm going to focus on today in terms of the traumatic event that we'll be discussing. And so let's start with some definitions, because that's what academics tend to do. Start with what exactly precisely we mean about something so you can't misconstrue what I'm talking about. And I'm going to give you a couple. There's lots of different definitions of disasters. Most of them are quite good. Here's a couple that we might use. This one is from McFarland and Norris. A disaster is a potentially traumatic event that's collectively experienced, has an acute onset, and is time delimited. So important aspects of this are that there's a collective experience. So if my house burns down, that's totally a disaster for me and my family. But it really doesn't have necessarily that collective impact that a disaster, when we say disasters, has. Disasters have acute onset, so they start at a certain time, and they're time delimited, so they end at some sort of time. And we can talk about moving into recovery and response, response and recovery and resilience. This is in contrast to more sort of acute traumatic stressors that a community might be experiencing, such as poverty or ongoing community violence. And we know that communities that experience high rates of poverty, high rates of community violence, look like they've been hit by a disaster, right? I mean, they literally look like a disaster has come through here oftentimes. And so the effects of these type of events are similar, and there's a lot of overlap, but those more chronic events we usually separate out from an actual disaster. Here's the World Health Organization. A disaster is a severe disruption, ecological and psychosocial, which greatly exceeds the coping capacity of the altered community. So not only do disasters destroy things like buildings and homes and harm people, there's also a psychosocial impact. And that's what we're going to focus on today in terms of community effects. And the thing about a disaster is we know disasters occur generally whenever the community needs some assistance in coping. So when Joplin was struck by the tornado in 2011, they needed resources from the outside to come in and help. And so we see that as a disaster. When a school when a school community experiences an event, a mass shooting, they need resources from outside to come in and help with coping and help adjust to the altered reality, the changed reality. Now, when we talk about disasters, there's different types. We can think about natural disasters and man-made disasters most basically, right? And so natural disasters are the disasters maybe you think of first and foremost when I say the word disaster, things such as tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, et cetera, acts of God they're often referred to, right? These occurrences that happen as a result of nature and climate. We can also think about man-made disasters, and we often break those further into two categories, non-intentional and intentional. So non-intentional disasters are things like the BP oil spill, or maybe the Exxon Valdez crash, or a nuclear meltdown, where the disaster was the result of humans and human systems, but it wasn't on purpose, right? It might have been negligent, it might have been really dumb and stupid, but it wasn't on purpose. Nobody meant to spill the oil into the Gulf. Conversely, we have intentional human-caused disasters, which are those that are on purpose, right? Such as terrorist attacks, such as mass shootings, where it's like a disaster occurred, a human caused it, and it was on purpose. And you know, breaking this apart are a good way to sort of understand the events and broaden our thinking about what disasters are. Generally in the literature, can you guess which of these we find sort of most distressing for people? Right, intentional human-caused disasters tend to be more distressing for us as humans than these other events because it was on purpose and there was malintent. And why did this happen? You know, we don't ask ourselves, why did the tornado strike Joplin? We might ask ourselves, why were we not better prepared? Why did we not get warning? There might be some questions we have for sure, but we don't really say, well, maybe we do. Maybe we do have a reckoning with God, but it's not the same, right? The other thing I'll say is that these categories help us understand events, but often events cut across categories. And Hurricane Katrina is a great example of this, wherein the disaster was a hurricane, but really the disaster was more, kind of broadly speaking, a flood resulting from the hurricane. But really there was a lot of human-caused factors in that in terms of levees failing. And maybe that was just, you know, poor planning. Maybe it was negligence. When we did a lot of work in Louisiana following Hurricane Katrina, you heard from a lot of residents of New Orleans that, no, this wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't even negligence. It was purposeful government agencies destroying certain levees to flood poor areas, and this was an intentional disaster. And that really changes the scope of things about how you're affected by that if you now believe that what happened was purposeful. But anyway, the larger point is just that sometimes these events don't necessarily fit into clean categories. And we can have a tornado and say, hey, the tornado occurred, but what was really bad was the planning and the response, and thus there's a lot of human-caused pieces to this. We also think about crises as another type of thing that might affect a community. And this is just a dictionary definition of what a crisis might be, a time of intense difficulty, trouble, or danger. So if we have an event that meets our definition of a disaster, it's probably also a crisis, but we can potentially have crises that affect communities that aren't disasters. We can have these other kind of large-scale events that can occur that would have an effect on a community. In the crisis communication literature, I'm guessing some of you have had a crisis communication course, maybe you even teach it. We really, whenever we say crisis communication in the communication field, we're talking about we're talking about communication to protect organizations relative to crises. We're talking about a public relations activity. So if Tylenol has a product that is poisoning people, what do you do communicatively to protect the organization and keep our share prices from dropping and we don't lose our jobs and go out of business and that sort of thing? So that's a very specific type of crisis. And it's not always necessarily related to these other things that we might be thinking about in terms of disasters and other kind of community events. So that's kind of a weirdness in the literature, at least from the communication and journalism side, that we need to be aware of. That oftentimes crisis communication folks aren't really talking about community crises, right? They're talking about organizational crises. And so here in Missouri, you know, and hopefully and other places of the nation, we've been thinking a lot about what are these community crises? What are these effects of these type of events, right? This is Ferguson. There have been subsequent events in Baltimore and South Carolina and a series of these of not really disasters, not really a specific kind of thing that we can name, but events that are occurring that are having impacts on community. and having disparate impacts on communities and disparate impacts on community members. And so I don't have a definition for this yet, because this is kind of an area that we're working through of what are these type of events and what are the effects of them. But I want to put it on the radar because it's what we're thinking about and what a lot of us will be covering and talking about in terms of journalism and crisis journalism. Okay, so I want to talk about now the effects of disaster. And I can go through most of these slides pretty quickly because Alana has covered a lot of this, and that's helpful, right? But the effects of disaster are the kind of obvious and literal ones we think about, in that disasters can injure people, can kill people, can destroy buildings, can have economic impacts on communities, on businesses, on households, and they can also have psychological effects. And that's kind of the next piece that maybe is not as obvious and comes to our mind when we immediately think of disasters, but really is typically or is often or can be the broadest effect on a community, are the psychological effects across the overall city of Joplin or Tuscaloosa or other places that are experiencing disasters. And so when we think about these psychological effects, they're the traumatic reactions that Alana talked about. The ways that we might react to sort of any traumatic event could be applied to our direct experience with disasters or disasters in our community. And so we can have things like fear and anxiety reactions, separation anxiety, particularly for children, right? Suddenly your community has experienced a disaster and children don't want to be separated from their parents because of the fear and anxiety that has occurred as a result of the disaster. Phobic reactions, sadness, grief, right, are the typical kind of psychological reactions we see following disasters. We can have anger, right? Anger towards the shooters, anger towards the terrorists, anger towards FEMA, anger towards the governor, anger towards the mayor. We can have guilt, survival guilt. You know, why was my neighbor harmed when I wasn't? Why was my family harmed when I wasn't? Regret that we should have done something differently. If I would have only done this, then we wouldn't have been in the path of the storm and we wouldn't have been hurt. So this is just, the thumbnail overview of the type of reactions and effects that disasters can have on people. And we can also have behavioral changes, right? Changes in behavior. So Alana talked about it. I was down to 1 cigarette a day, but I experienced a disaster and now I'm back up to a pack a day, or I'm drinking more than I used to or normally do. So we have these kind of stressors that cause literal behavioral changes. I'm more irritable. I have somatic complaints. I'm having headaches and stomach aches and these sorts of things. And here's a nice overview of responses to a traumatic event or responses to a disaster. And the best thing about this table is it shows how significant these can be, right? That we can have cognitive, emotional, physical, and behavioral psychological reactions to an event. Bless you. So not only might it affect our thinking, it might affect our emotional system, it might affect us physically. Now I'm not sleeping as much as I was, now I'm grinding my teeth, now I have a stomach ache, and it can affect our behavior. Now my work isn't as good, now I'm not getting along with my spouse as well as I was, now I'm short with my children. And so this is significant, right? I mean, these are like real effects. This isn't just, I'm upset. This is something that can be significant. As Alana mentioned also then, at sort of the beyond having reactions and beyond having some effects related to these events, we can have kind of full-blown clinical conditions. And we generally, in terms of disasters, think about post-traumatic stress disorder as being the main kind of clinical reaction that we investigate, at least from a research or science side. We can also have clinical depression, we can have comorbidity, but that's sort of the high-end, full clinical end of the spectrum of the types of reactions and effects a disaster might have. So normally whenever we think about experiencing a traumatic event, we think about having some sort of direct experience with the event. So we were there, we saw it, we were involved. Or maybe we had some experience through a family member. Our mother was involved in the disaster, our child was, and so we get that sort of exposure. with the continued advancement of media, we now have another mechanism where we can at least be somewhat exposed to events such as disasters and mass shootings and terrorist attacks. And this starts with radio, TV, and television. It gets even more intimate as our media forms expand into social media, into people being on the scene and taking direct raw video of a shooting and us being immediately exposed to that. That is a quite intimate exposure to events that that wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. And so the takeaway here is that media and journalism and us, technology, I guess, expand the scope of people who can be affected by these kind of large-scale events. Can be affected by any events, but definitely these kind of large-scale, attention-grabbing events. And so media expand the number of people who are potentially affected by a disaster. And that's where we start to get into really thinking about community and population level effects of events. And when we think about community or population or public health effects of events, this is kind of the perspective we take, or we expect. And so if a community is affected by disasters such as Joplin or Tuscaloosa or Central Texas, the communities down there that experience flooding, what we generally expect to see in the people living in that community is this pattern of effects, wherein, if you look at this axis right here, this is the number of people affected or having reactions, from few at the bottom to many at the top. And then we have severity of symptoms mapped out on the bottom axis, from mild reactions or few reactions to very severe and many. And across a community or across a population, what we tend to see is a lot of people having some very mild reactions or few reactions. So an event occurs, there's a major tornado, a lot of people might be upset, might be worried, may have changes in sleep, may be a bit more irritable than they were. So they're having reactions that we can see. They're just not, super severe, and there's not maybe a lot of them. And then we sort of go down the lines. We get to the middle where we've got fewer people having a bit more severe reactions. So fewer people having multiple reactions, maybe they're a bit more intense, until we get to this bottom end here where we have even fewer people having very severe clinical reactions. And so from a services or public health perspective, it's what sort of interventions and programs can we provide to a community following an event like a disaster that can meet this diverse need, where lots of people need a little something and few people need something quite significant, and there's people in the middle, and how do we meet that need? And so then I guess, to really pick up on Colleen's trajectory of what are the stories we're telling, what are these stories here across this trajectory in a community following an event? From the lots of people having mild reactions to the medium people having medium reactions to this more significant impact. Because that's the community story of an event. That's the population story of a disaster often. And so capturing that from a journalistic perspective is one of the things we might be thinking about doing. Time is important in terms of a disaster. I was reading a paper the other day, and it was talking about something that happened, and it was completely non-related to the time of a disaster or something like this. But the reality is, we're always somewhere on this circular circle of the snake eating its tail of the disaster timeline, right? We're always somewhere between recovering from an event or preparing for an event. We think that we are immune and we're not on this timeline, but we are, right? I mean, a disaster will strike Columbia, Missouri at some point. Maybe it's 100 years, maybe it's 200 years, maybe it's tomorrow, but we're always on this. And we're always informed by past events and our experiences with past events, thinking about events that are coming up. We're always on sort of this hamster wheel, I guess might be the way to describe it. And this too is a good way to talk to young journalists about, if they're thinking about covering disasters in their community, realize this is the reality. That there are risks in this community, that there are possibilities, that there should be some planning and preparation going on, and thinking about what that is dealing with this issue and the reality that we're always sort of thinking about what might happen and being informed by previous events. The other thing, Alana had this slide the other day. This is a color version though, so yeah, it's very nice, isn't it? And the one thing I want to say about it, since she explained it expertly, was that we know that disasters, natural disasters, man-made disasters, get a lot of media coverage, especially big disasters, right? It receives a huge amount of media influx and coverage. We get a lot of national coverage coming into communities like Tuscaloosa, like Joplin, to be there. We also know that they're not there very long, right? They're there in huge numbers and very intense ways for a short amount of time, really. They quickly move on. The national media turn away from major disasters faster than they turn away from other issues in terms of our research about how long issues are in the news. So we see the intense coverage and we know that it's covered a lot, but it's for a short period of time. And so what happens is the media typically leave somewhere, is there a pointer on this? Probably not, but the media, the national media, if a community is affected by a significant disaster, are typically leaving somewhere in this honeymoon phase, right? So that's it. To wrap up tonight's newscast from Joplin, the Joplin citizens are resilient. They're going to rebuild. They say they don't need any help. They're going to take care of themselves, and all is going to be well. Back to you, right? And that's like the end of the story as the media leaves town. And of course, we know what the actual rest of the story is, kind of falling off this cliff here of dealing with the reality of massive impact on a disaster. And the national media typically aren't there. Who is there? The local media are there. The local media, the local journalists who are also dealing with all of these reactions. And I'm going to talk a bit about the role of journalism in terms of resilience, but when we're depending on our local journalists to have a role in overall community resilience and deal with all of this, that's actually quite a tall order. Not an easy thing to do. To deal with the effects and then the long trajectory towards rebuilding and reconstruction. Someone asked yesterday, where is New Orleans on this? Or we might ask, where is Tuscaloosa on this? Or where is Joplin on this? And even that's not an easy answer. Because you might ask someone and you say, hey, we're totally reconstructed and on our way. And you might ask someone else and they're like, we're still completely suffering and have not gotten over this and are still having lots of troubles as a result of what occurred. And you get lots of arguments about, is it time for the community to just move on and stop talking about the tornado? Can't we talk about something else? And then you have others saying, how dare you not talk about the tornado, right? I mean, you can't not talk about this. That's so offensive. So there's that's going on in the community, and that discussion and those issues are what will be in the local coverage of the events. So again, this was really sort of covered yesterday, but I guess I just want to say that understanding how people are affected by disasters or other traumatic events is not simple. There are lots of things that are going into that calculation. From their actual exposure to the event, from what the event is, to their subjective reactions, is just one piece of the overall pie, right? Their pre-existing experiences, their existing resources, the social support, right? The family and social support and what resources they have in terms of being able to cope with the event and recover from the event. And so even this story of experiencing major events and how it affects individuals and communities and groups within communities is not a simple story or a simple calculation. It's quite a rich story and quite a complex story. And we often try to break it down and make it very simple, but that's not the reality. So disaster journalism. Our center is really trying to think through, what is good disaster journalism? What can disaster journalism do? What should journalists be doing in terms of disasters? If we're always on this hamster wheel of disasters, what does that mean for journalists working in a community? If a community has affected a major disaster, what should sort of be going on, and what are the and I'm going to totally moving forward, I'm going to totally steal Colleen's sort of conceptualization of the spokes and the different issues of how you might think about a community affected by disaster, because that was so rich and helpful, practical. But we know that most of what we know about disasters, all of us in the room, and we probably think we know quite a bit about disasters, most of what we know we learn through the media, right? So even if you've experienced a major tornado, probably what you know about hurricanes or landslides or floods or blizzards or whatever, you learn through the media coverage, right? Very few of us, unless we're out there sort of seeking these things, have experienced most types of disasters personally. So we learn a lot through the media, and what the media tell us about disasters and risks and recovery are important in understanding how we think about these risks. We know that the American public consumes media coverage of disasters, natural and man-made, at greater levels than anything else. So Hurricane Katrina, September, the 9/11 attacks, like these are the things that we all watch and we can't get enough of, and we're totally binging on the TV for days until someone tells us to turn it off, hopefully. So we learn a lot about media through journalism, and we watch a lot of it. And so it's extremely important, right? In understanding what our risks are, what we should be doing, how we should be planning, this sort of thing. The other thing we know is that we don't like to think about disasters, right? I mean, we don't want to think about, could we experience a disaster? We don't want to get prepared. Those of us, it's difficult to get people to have disaster kits. It's difficult to get people to do any of this stuff. We just don't want to think about it or deal with it until it happens to our community. And so it is kind of a hard pitch from a journalism perspective of, okay, if people don't really want to deal with this, but we know we have a role in sort of helping make sure our community is prepared, how do we do that, right? How do we create content that people will pay attention to that we think is quite needed when people don't want to think about it? And maybe all these traumatic kind of issues that we're talking about are things we just don't want to talk about, right? And don't want to think about and just want to explain away. And that's kind of a piece of, to get back to Colleen's talk, of victim blaming. If we just blame the victim, then we don't have to worry about it, right? She shouldn't have been doing that. And I don't have to worry about this anymore. I've explained away the threat. I've explained away the risk to myself and my family, my friends. So it's a tough kind of issue to be dealing with. And so there's a lot of practical work needed in how can we do this? And let's experiment, and let's think about different ways to tell stories, and what are new kind of things we could do. I'm going to come back to this question. I'm going to talk a little bit about resilience, and then I'm going to come back to, so what should disaster journalism look like? So keep that question kind of in your mind, so you can tell me. You can give me the answer, because we've been kind of struggling with it. I want to talk about resilience. We've mentioned it a lot. I want to talk about it just a little bit more, and I want to talk about it in terms of community resilience. So this idea of resilience really comes from physical sciences. Resilience is originally a material or physical property. This idea that you could stress a material and it will return to its original shape. And so, of course, the metaphor we often look at is the rubber band. You stretch it, and it goes back to its original shape. Ergo, it's resilient. Now, of course, rubber bands are not always resilient, right? You can break a rubber band, stretch it hard enough, and it breaks, and now it's no longer resilient. But as long as we don't overstress it, we can see some resilience. And that is also a good metaphor for us as humans, that we have this capacity for resilience, but even the most resilient of us, that's not infinite. You can certainly snap part of us, right? Break us. No one is completely and utterly resilient. Now, we apply this concept of material properties to humans, and think about humans then in terms of resilience. And we mentioned it, a definition of kind of a easy definition or easy explanation of resilience is this idea that we can bounce back following an adverse event. Bounce back is resilience. It's probably the most common definition you're going to hear, and most common explanation. And it captures that rubber, right? You bounce a rubber ball, it bounces right back to you, so it's resilient. Now, when we talk about human resilience, we can be talking about a lot of different levels. We can talk about individual resilience. How resilient am I? How resilient are you? How resilient are your children? How resilient is your family, right? Which is a human system, and so it's a little bit different than just, am I resilient and are my kids resilient? Is our family resilient as an overall unit of human existence? We think a lot here about is our campus, the University of Missouri, resilient? And we've done some work in sort of trying to get a sense of how do we know if our campus is resilient and our campus community is resilient. We can think about community resilience that I'll talk about a little bit. We can talk about overall social resilience or regional resilience. So is the Midwest resilient against an economic downturn, or is the Midwest resilient against whatever? When we think about larger scales, we can think about the resilience of the nation, the United States, or whatever nation you're from. And then we can also think about global resilience. And that's kind of like when we think about climate change, that's one of the things we think of, like how resilient is the global climate to these stressors? It seems to be resilient, but at some point, you know, we worry it'll break. Yes?
How do you keep, as a journalist, from sort of the idea of talking about resiliency from bordering on the kind of heroic, you know, trope of, oh, look how resilient and this community is, to keep it at sort of more of the, not the scientific level that you're talking about here, but to move it beyond the, you know, oh, look, you know, they're so supportive of each other and they're, you know, yeah.
So we'll talk about that a little bit, and we'll talk about what we can talk about is what would our model of community resilience look like, so that we might talk about what is resilience more than just we put up signs that said we're more strong, you know, or more Oklahoma, right, or Joplin strong, you know, or they have those signs in every disaster, right? The floods in Boulder, it was Boulder strong. It's like a trope, right? And it's like an industry. I sell the blank strong signs, and after your disaster, order here, right? I mean, same thing with mass shootings, right? I mean, we talked about it again. We have, this is the story. And the story, again, when the media, national media leave town is we are more strong and we're gonna be okay. And it's like, awesome, I don't have to worry about you people anymore. I can move on about my business. And like, if it happens here, great. We're gonna be Columbia strong and we'll be just fine because we're different than other people and we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? Is always the story. And that's probably protective and helpful, right? In that initial shock to have some, like, we have efficacy and we can band together and we can do things. I can remember being in Oklahoma City after the bombing and getting on the highway, and I used to, because I was driving down to Norman, and it was just this treacherous intersection, and it was always just like you just had to get on up to speed and get on as quick as you can. And after the Oklahoma City bombing, I was getting up to go to Norman, and people were just slowing down and waving me in. You know, it was like kumbaya society. We've all been changed, we've all grown. But we know that quickly passes once the reality, so that was a long, winding explanation to say, I'll keep moving through my slides and we'll talk about it some more. Okay, here is a way that we might think about resilience graphically. And so the thing I want to say about resilience is, I really see resilience as a process. And the way we could measure resilience is to, if we want to break it down into scientific terms, is to have a sense of pre-event functioning. An event occurs, and then we can measure post-event functioning to kind of see resilience. So we're not measuring it directly, we're using other indicators. So what's my overall health and well-being before I experience a disaster? A disaster occurs 6 months later, how am I doing? If I've kind of gotten back to my baseline levels, if I'm doing kind of as good as I was doing before, then maybe you could conclude I'm resilient. And that's kind of a brutal way to think about it, or a very reductionist kind of way, but we can't, it's difficult to directly observe. But this illustrates that process where we have pre-event functioning, a crisis happens, this top piece is what we might call resistance. So if you experience a crisis and your functioning is not affected, it just kind of stays the same, we might say you were resistant or you weren't affected. And honestly, if we see people like this after a major crisis, we might be concerned about them because, you know, you weren't affected at all, that, you know, maybe you're not affected yet. But that, at least conceptually, is this theoretical path of you experience a crisis, nothing happens, you're resistant, you go on about your business. What we more typically see is some sort of transient dysfunction. So from, again, that population perspective of lots of people feeling a little bit upset, other people being more affected, you know, we're all somewhere in here of more upset, more worried than we were. We're resilient when we kind of bounce back, right? When we get back to our baseline levels eventually. When we don't recover, then we're vulnerable and we're probably in need of some additional assistance. The thing that this illustrates, this model then, because this is time, right, moving forward from before the event to after the event, is that resilience is not really ever about bouncing back because you're moving forward in time. What it might be best known as is bouncing forward. So time is moving and you bounce forward to kind of back to where you were before the event. But this acknowledges that things have changed, right? So you're not just exactly the same person you were before the disaster, even if you've kind of gotten back to cutting out smoking cigarettes and got your drinking back under control. It's not the same reality. It's a new reality that you've bounced forward to and are somehow back to your pre-event level of functioning. As Alana mentioned, there's also a trajectory of growth, which might kind of put us further and better up on the spectrum, but we don't necessarily see that here. This, I think, is the same slide that Alana showed yesterday, or at least another version, kind of flipping where lower is better and higher is more problematic. And the idea that resilient might be just a little bit of effect and then recovery, as opposed to a pretty significant effect in terms of the impact and then recovery, as opposed to other trajectories which the negative impact is more sustained. And so we can think about resilience in these sorts of ways in terms of our reactions kind of at any level, right? We could apply that model to any level of system, community, individual, family, whatever. Now, community resilience is something more than just a bunch of resilient individuals. So maybe we're all resilient in this room. If we did a measure and some assessments, we said we're all resilient. But the question of whether us as a community is resilient is a separate question. Now, lots of resilient individuals might be correlated with a community, with a resilient community, but at the end of the day, the point is just that a resilient community is not just a bunch of resilient individuals. It's a community being resilient in sort of interactive and relational ways. And so we have emerges from collective activity in which individuals join together to foster response for the whole. So not just recovery for me and my family and my block, but recovery for the whole community. So not only is it collective, but it's focused on the community as well. This is Fran Norris and her colleagues. They have the seminal paper on community resilience. That's the best place to start if you want an academic reading on it. And so this is their very academic explanation. But they define community resilience as a network of adaptive capacities that allows a community to recover, not a static end state. And this is what they model community resilience as. And so this kind of gets at your question, Rachel, of, if you're wanting to move beyond just the we're more strong, and you want to think about covering community resilience, you can potentially dig into these constructs that we hypothesize and theorize inform community resilience. And the thing I'll sort of point out about this is that this is quite complex, and it's like a lot of stuff. It's not an easy answer of what makes a community resilient. And it's not just that we feel good about ourselves, it's a lot more than that, right? And so we've got sort of these 4 domains that are theorized in terms of community resilience. One is social capital. And so social capital might be the social support. How well are community members connected? How well do they interact? How much are they attached to each other? How much are they attached to the place? And so we think about New Orleans as a good example of a situation where we saw a lot of place attachment. And so that might be a good reservoir of community resilience in that community. Maybe at the same time, we see that a lot of the citizens in New Orleans were displaced and disconnected. And so that's a real stressor in terms of community resilience, that the community members are no longer connected and interacting with each other and supporting each other. So within these individual domains, we can think about, stressors and strengths. Community competence is another domain. Is the community flexible? Do they have good problem solving capacities and mechanisms? Community action, does community action occur? We also have economics, right? I mean, we can't act as if community resilience is not about resources and economic resources. Communities that have more resources are likely going to be more resilient than those that don't. And communities in which the resource distribution is equitable. So communities that have lots of really wealthy folks and lots of really poor folks overall are probably going to be more challenged in terms of resilience as an overall community than a community where the resources are more equitably distributed. Because again, remember, community resilience is about the recovery of the community, not just the people that live high on the land that weren't flooded and have private insurance. So this equitability is a big piece of that. And then finally, information and communication. And I'll point out that information and communication, which we're glad to see in the model as communication people, has things like trusted sources of information, narratives. That sounds good. I'm not quite sure what it means. Skills and infrastructure. And then it has responsible media. So that's you all and your students. So as long as a community has responsible media, then there may be more resilience. Now, what is responsible media? That's a good question, right? And not addressed at all in this paper. And that's maybe where we would kind of dive into of what do we think responsible media are relative to disasters and community resilience and community crises. I think I have one more community resilience slide, and then I'll sort of leave it there. The thing we noticed about this model, again, as sort of media and journalism and communication people, was there's actually a lot of communication kind of everywhere. So we noticed a few things. A, this is a very complex model. B, there's a lot going on. C, the things don't always kind of seem to be the same units, like they're kind of different types of things. And then D, there's a lot of communication cutting across it. So we've got our whole communication domain, but community action and community problem solving and political partnerships is very much about communication, connections, interactions. Social support and sense of community are also quite communicative. And so we took kind of another pass at this model and tried to break it into blocks that worked a little bit more for us, where we pulled out the communication systems and resources and put them at the top. So a community has communication systems and resources from media and official sources of information, but also community organizations and even things like tornado sirens, right? So we really have these systems that we could pull out of the model. And then that leaves us with some other things that we can think about. The relationships in a community. So citizens' relationships with each other, media relationships, political partnerships, sense of community. We can pull out and just think, okay, what do the relationships look like in our community? What are the attributes of our community? How efficacious are we? How diverse are we? How creative are we? We can think about sort of these attributes that are kind of characteristics that we can conceptualize. And then we can think about strategic communication processes that can occur through these mechanisms of systems and relationships. And we can think about what are the processes that we foster community competence through critical planning and action. What are our community stories? Who's telling stories? Who's telling new stories? Who's challenging stories? Where are those stories coming from? How can we talk about disaster and risk in a community where we don't want to think about disaster and risk? And how can we talk about and focus on community and economic development that improves the community but also doesn't leave anyone behind? And so we kind of think that this model, it's still just as complex and kind of overwhelming, but maybe if we start just pulling out pieces of this, lines of this, then it'll give us practical action and programs that we can pursue to try to do something that at the end of the day would foster a more resilient community. And so I think good disaster journalism, fits here and should probably kind of more explicitly be on the chart. But good disaster journalism in that journalism that's telling stories that help, that are useful. Good disaster journalism that is fostering community competence, discussion of disaster and risk, economic development, so on and so forth. So again, maybe in terms of Colleen's wheel of story ideas, these kind of processes are the things that we can talk about in terms of disaster journalism. So that was a mouthful. So maybe I'll turn, I think we can go to questions now, but maybe I'll start with the question of, so what do you think the role, and when I go to talk to Catherine's class, I often ask this, what is the role of journalism in disasters? Yeah.
I'm not sure this is actually going to answer the question, but I'm thinking of a book, and probably someone in here knows the name, and I'm completely drawing a blank on it. But it has to do with the threefold model of journalism in disasters or in trauma or in grief, and I can't quite remember which one it is, but essentially it becomes journalist as reporter. When an event initially happens, they just need to kind of outline, okay, X number, these number of people were hurt, injured, kind of, where do you need to go? If it's a tornado, here are your safe shelters or something like that. And then it becomes journalist as advocate, which again is pushing for people who need more resources and kind of highlighting some of the specific cases, obviously anecdotally, not so much systematically. But then it becomes journalist as skeptic, and which is then questioning the responses. And they use a lot of, I've seen it with Katrina, I've seen it with, and I want to say, like I said, I feel embarrassed that I can't remember who it is that wrote this book, but I'm sure somebody knows. I think it's that, and I was just kind of curious what your thoughts were in terms of following that model. If that's an effective, I wonder if that's a responsible media in your model that you were talking about before. Right.
So I guess what I would say is that we usually focus on that first one in terms of disaster journalism. How do you cover the story? How do you get out breaking news? How do you report on what's going on? And it's all hands on deck. And lots of sincere and good work goes into that. And there are good models and guidance for that. And maybe it doesn't always happen perfectly. And it's a little off-putting to have hundreds of reporters at a place. But generally, we're there covering the news in terms of breaking news of a disaster. It's those other two pieces that maybe sometimes fall off the radar, at least in national news, maybe not as much in local, but actually orienting journalists into some of those kind of functions, I think would be helpful. Now, in terms of the last one, you know, where I'm interested in the role of blame in community disaster recovery, you know, and so this watchdog role of journalism, you know, I'm 100% behind. And so that kind of exposing wrongdoing is watchdog journalism in my mind, and assigning blame. And I'm curious what the role of media assigning blame following a disaster is in helping communities recover and move forward. And I don't know, I mean, like, I would say, yeah, they need to be doing that and it needs to happen, but it would be interesting to know a little bit more about how that works, how the community latches onto that and moves forward and incorporates it into the narratives of their experiences. You know, and in some ways we get back to victim blaming. You know, is it that once we have blame, we don't have to worry about it anymore because it was just the dumb jerks that did this? You know, it's just FEMA and they're terrible and whatever. And like, that's the end of the story. We don't have to think about it anymore. Or can blame sort of somehow fuel things that are actually helpful? So that's something that I would be interested in studying more. The other thing is, what we really need is the blame ahead of time, right? Like, that would be a lot more helpful, right? And so that's good opportunities for journalism of what are the knuckleheads doing now that are totally leaving us exposed and they shouldn't be doing, that if we fixed, you know, if something occurs, could happen. But that takes a lot more energy and momentum. You know, that's investigative journalism, right? Which is the hard slog.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking about a couple things. One, that, you know, watchdog journalism, good watchdog journalism doesn't really have to employ a blame frame. If you're really doing good watchdog journalism all along and you're sort of looking carefully at agencies and government entities that are supposed to play a role in making sure communities are prepared for disasters, then you're not in this situation. I was also thinking about some of the criticism of the media's coverage of Ferguson, which was, I mean, you know, here was a slow motion, not so slow motion sometimes, disaster for this community. And what we learned, of course, was underlying it was a real failure to cover problems in Ferguson, really serious injustices that had been occurring for years that had not been getting perhaps the attention they should have received. So, you know, I think it is kind of a failure when we end up with stories that are, and you just pointed out the hazard of this, you know, that are like, oh, it's somebody's fault. It's this one thing.
Right.
And, you know, of course, that's just never true.
Right.
Or rarely true.
And we love to explain, you know, we love to identify the bad actors, put the blame on them, and that's the end of the story. Now we don't have any responsibility to have any sort of change or change in thinking.
Yeah, that analogy that you just drew, I've never heard anybody say that before, and it's really interesting. It really ought to give us pause, because you know, maybe we are like sort of unconsciously doing the same thing. You know, when we're like, oh, well, I'd never wear a really short skirt and walk to my car by myself at night, you know, so that will never happen to me.
Right.
Right. So, oh, okay.
I make good decisions,
Yeah.
so I'm going to be okay. It's not going to happen to me, right? Just like we're never going to be in a car accident. I mean, all these things. Yeah.
I was going to answer your question
Great.
about the role of journalists. I guess I'm thinking on Afifi's work in forest fires in California, and how communal coping can actually exacerbate stress and make things worse. So I guess my theory is that journalists need to be sort of a catalyst for fostering and getting this community coping started, because if you just get a bunch of panicked people together, I don't think that that's the most productive use of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, so I guess, yes, fostering the discussion in a helpful way is exactly what media need to be doing. What that means is the real question. I don't, in terms of a bunch of panicked people, we don't really see a lot of panic following disasters. I mean, we see distress and things like that, but so I guess I think that there's the momentum there to structure discussions that could be helpful and adaptive and foster recovery. But that's going to take some really thoughtful approaches to what journalism is literally doing in the recovery phase and the response phase of a disaster and ahead of time of disasters. And so kind of figuring some of those things out is the real challenge. And we know that, in some other work about disasters, we know that people want to talk about disasters a lot after they occur and they've experienced them. And soon after, people don't want to hear it anymore. And so not wanting to hear it is a big issue. Like, I don't want to hear it anymore. Even if I want to talk about it, I don't want to hear about it anymore. And so now you've got journalism trying to operate in that of people want to talk about it, they're still stressed, there's still the change needed, they don't want to hear about it, they don't want to think about it. It again becomes that dance that Alana talked about of approach avoidance. I don't want to talk about it, I want to move on. I'm resilient, I'm actually stressed. And so in that dance, what can journalism do to make it a more elegant dance as opposed to something, where you're stepping on each other's feet? I don't know, to extend the metaphor.
So I think, oh, sorry, Tom, just one second. This will be the first of probably 30 times I'm going to recommend this book. That's the textbook, the first book my students read in my class. And what they say to me about this book, I got to tell you, is I will never sell this book back. I will not lend this book. This is the best book I have read in my education. And it relates directly to this topic and to this conversation. The book is called The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes and Why, by Amanda Ripley. And it provides really a great framework for the beginning of the class where, we really talk about how people behave in disaster situations. And there are many anecdotes in that book related to preparation and how communities that have actually practiced, a tsunami drill, for example. This is a topic that's really front of mind right now for people in the Pacific Northwest since the New Yorker piece was published this summer. I don't know how many of you saw this piece about, it's called The Big One, about when this inevitable earthquake and tsunami is going to occur and everybody's going to die. I mean, it is one of the most terrifying magazine stories I've ever read, and the reaction to it was immediate and intense. From people who live in that part of the world. The New Yorker has followed up with a blog post that was a little more helpful in terms of service journalism about what people can do, but
Move.
So yeah, move. Give up your great house. So there's lots of information about how little rehearsals. And this idea of coping is what I was getting back to here, is really helpful for people in terms of living with the potential for a disaster, because there are a lot of people in the world who live in disaster-prone areas. They tend to be the most beautiful places in the world.
Right.
Frankly, people who live in the lava flow zone on the Big Island of Hawaii, people who live on cliffs where mudslides are prevalent. And now with climate change, there are a lot more people who fit in this category. So anyway, there's my first pitch from Amanda Ripley's book. I don't get a percentage, but I have written her and said, I do not know how I would teach this class without your book. Thank you. Here's Tom.
I wanted to make a suggestion on the scale, on the recovery scale. There's a mention of grief, and I think part of the dance is moving forward while also a community grieving. And what the example I would give is the Globe. One reporter did life stories of almost all 153 people who died. over a course of 6, 8, 9 months. That's not talking about the tornado. That's talking about the people's who live there and their lives and what they experience. So I would add to as we're listing roles, helping people grieve would be one.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's memorialization as well, and it's also, you know, the story or these stories of the individuals and the community members. So there's a lot of kind of threads there. And you're right, that's a way to approach the subject that gives another line that can be helpful and hit on some other things without being directly about them. Yeah.
Just wanted to get back to the, you know, what would be a good kind of disaster journalist. And for me, a lot of what, you know, watching the coverage of, you know, hurricanes, big tornadoes, whatever, is just, especially at the national level, how breathless some of the first, like, you know, I mean, every single reporter wants to make his or her career by standing out in the middle of a hurricane. And it's like, come on, we know what a hurricane looks like when it is happening. Like, there's nothing unique about this particular hurricane in terms of like its wind and its rain. And I mean, to me, it's more that the focus has got to be less on, oh my God, I'm standing out here in a hurricane, and getting more towards, you know, just basic. And I know this is we consume it, they want to see it because it gets ratings, but I'd like to see a lot less of, you know, the wall to wall, I'm here live, grabbing these people to get them live on TV kind of thing. So that first part, if we're going on that scale, as, you know, journalist as informer with breaking news, all hands, is, you know, make it accurate and don't make it breathless. Don't, you know, make it like, oh my God, I've never seen a hurricane before. BS, you were standing out the last hurricane.
Yeah.
I have something to say that probably piggybacks off that. So you said that people get to a point where they don't want to talk about it anymore, but maybe I wonder what they're really saying is I don't want to talk about it the same way anymore. And I think that comes up with school shootings and gun control and gun violence. I mean, it's always the same thing. So perhaps the role of a journalist in disaster is maybe to be innovative and brave enough to step outside of the hurricane. I'm standing in a hurricane and covering everything the same way all the time. Because I know that makes me want to tune out, and I'm part of this equation. I want to tune out of those tired conversations and coverages.
Yeah, so, and again, just to clarify, it's not that people don't want to talk about it, they don't want to hear about it, you know, and so people who are affected want to talk about it, they just don't want to hear about it anymore. And so that's kind of the same, that's tuning out, right? I don't want to hear about this anymore. I don't want to hear about this shooting. I don't want to hear about anything. And so I tune everything out unless something so big happens that it captures my attention as a new threat. And so now the only thing that I'm paying attention to are the new biggest things. And that is not a very adaptive reaction to threats that are exerting a significant toll on human beings, right? And so, yeah, how do you break through that? And I mean, that is the real challenge, especially when we get used to it and we don't want to think about it at all. Good,
Having covered 4 hurricanes in Florida, I just want to make a pitch for the print and online reporters who are out there days before and days after, who aren't in the wind pretending to be blown away. I remember a story a few days before hurricane was headed, Hurricane Francis, interviewing people who were tying down their house. I mean, it was, me and a photojournalist out there, like, whoa, this person is literally trying to stake their house to the ground, in a sense of panic. And then being out there in the days after and giving information on, where to get blue tarps and where to get water and where to get ice, and schools were closed for a month. And I think there is some good reporting that still happens after disasters, and trying to get information out to people and building it in a narrative way that can help people remember, people who couldn't get medication, senior citizens who couldn't get oxygen tanks. But I just wanted to make a pitch in terms of what you said for the Dave Collins book, Columbine, which I have as required reading. And I think it really does one of the best jobs that I've seen of explaining the media myths that get picked up, and that when we try to fit disaster into this narrative box, the mistakes that get made, like the trench coat mafia and some of these things that people remember after, that really have no
that's
realism.
A real problem too, because what we report first sticks forever. It gets it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, in these situations to change that narrative once it's been widely reported. And I'm so glad you brought up that book, because he really just takes apart how that happened.
And the simplest explanations. I mean, the simplest explanations are what really have utility for us, because it makes our world seem much more understandable and predictable. And, you know, it's like, okay, it's, you know, trench coat mafia. As long as I don't see that in my community, I'm okay. Yeah. Right? Like, that's all it is. So, right now I'm worried, but otherwise it's not going to happen to me.
So jumping off of what Catherine said about what you report first is the narrative, I would posit that putting Ferguson under the heading, what now the world calls Ferguson, with a lot of meaning, is not a disaster. I grew up in that neighborhood, in the general area. I went to Mike Brown's high school, he went to mine. It was the natural and logical consequence of systemic, economically driven racism in St. Louis that was known, that was engineered, that was supported, and is not reported in its historic significance. There were even attempts to forestall it that I know of. My dad was involved in it. The establishment of the University of Missouri St. Louis was a pushback to stabilize that neighborhood, that the Normandy School District gave the land to the state to build a university there, because the entire region had been redlined. The businesses got a better deal to go someplace else, so the jobs started leaving. The real estate agents absolutely made sure that the values of homes went down. Certain people were no longer shown the homes there. The schools were affected by the resulting loss of tax base. It was an engineered white flight. And people don't talk about it. They look at it like, those people there did this one thing, what a disaster. And what happened, absolutely, I feel very passionate about it, because the stories aren't told in that very definitive way. That was not a disaster. That was a logical outcome of what a institutionalized racist engineering created.
And you know, the other sort of line that we've talked about that really fits towards that in my mind is the fragmentation, right? The fact that St. Louis is so fragmented in the many municipalities and communities that you can fragment that city and separate it in ways that you're sort of talking about, and that lead to some of these conditions that are problematic, right? I mean, if you think about if St. Louis was much more united and thoughtful about the entire community, then maybe some of those fragmentations and things that went on would not have been possible. But it's built that you can sort of separate, and this area has a lot and this has little. I mean, it is very much constructed so that it is not equitable. And so just as, I mean, I'm following, I mean, in terms of other things we've talked about, in terms of the fragmentation of trauma, boy, St. Louis, in terms of how the city is laid out, is all about fragmentation.
We're going to have to make
yeah.
this the last question,
Okay.
because I need to get back on track here.
I wanted to make a comment about when people don't want to talk about the disaster anymore that has happened in their own community. That is an element of apathy that should be considered and needs to be taught to the students, that you are hearing apathy perhaps at large, that the people feel that regardless of what they say, regardless of the impact, they can't have any help. They aren't getting what they need. So
Yeah,
that might
good.
be an interesting concept that needs to be taught.
And we do get tired of, were you going to say something? Go ahead, yeah. I won't, I'll just.
She's begging,
Yeah.
she's saying, please.
I do think that in terms of your question about disaster journalism, I believe that there is also a media literacy piece to it as well, and that there has to be more done to understanding, for audiences to understand New Orleans Times-Picayune published a story before Katrina. Your levees are about to fail, people, right? I mean, St. Louis, it's not as if race or, not at the grand scale. Those stories, cops, reporters, I'm sure they were coming out. So it's as if, people only react to the big
crisis.
disaster story. When you want to say, well, wait a minute, I'm the beat reporter. I've been slogging through this stuff for weeks and months and years. So I do think there has to be a component, and maybe what disaster journalism in the internet age can help us do is say, and I think the Seattle Times did this after the mudslide. Like, we told you that, we did these stories that said for years that these people were at risk. And I just think there has to be a media literacy component to it, to understanding that there is good investigative work on some of these issues. The New Yorker piece is, maybe an example, and maybe helping people understand how they are at risk without creating, kind of panic.
Panic, anger, and frustration. No, it was an important point. I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks a lot,
Yeah, thank you.
Brian.